How you doing, guys? This is Eric from WorldWasteland.com. So we have seen tons of advancements in the conflict with Russia and NATO. It's not just Ukraine. I've been very adamant about that the whole time. And honestly, that's not even in dispute. NATO's admittedly supplying arms and massive amounts of monetary support to Ukraine. And this talk of trying to get, or at least Ukraine is trying to petition to get into NATO. Whether or not that actually happens is irrelevant. It just goes to show you the whole kind of dynamic at play here. But we're seeing constant increase in rhetoric on both sides, specifically related to nuclear stuff. We've seen movement of nuclear-capable arms and equipment via rail on Russia. And there's a lot of talk about what's going to happen over the next few months with Ukraine supposedly, winning now, if depending on who you ask. I certainly don't think that's the case, and I'll get into that in a bit. But the main point being that we're seeing a lot of increase in nuclear rhetoric, even though I think / hope that there won't actually be any nuclear exchange. The bottom line is we're at a higher chance of it now than at any point, certainly in the past 20 or 30 years, maybe even at the Cold War, the height of the Cold War. But it's at least that bad, and it keeps getting worse every day. And the governments around the world are preparing for this, so you need to be too. And there's a difference between preparing for something to happen and expecting it to happen. And I mean, obviously anyone watching this, any prepper should know that's basically what we do, is make sure that we prepare for things, even if we don't necessarily think they're going to happen, we realize that they can happen. And with something like when it comes to nuclear stuff like that, the basic preparations you can do outside of, like a bomb shelter for a direct hit, but the sort of the gas mask, like I have my mirrors say, and I'll put links in the description to this one, solid gas mask. When you're talking about gas mask, a little bit of Thyrosafe or potassium iodide, and a few minor things like that, you're talking a couple $100, $300 to $500 maybe, and you're betting your life by not getting this stuff. And the U.S. government's getting it. In fact, the U.S. government has splashes $290 million, so $300 million almost, on anti-radiation drugs after Putin ups nuclear threats. And these aren't the potassium iodide specifically. We have reports from Canadian Prepper and other people in the industry that produce this stuff and sell it, that governments around the world are buying up all the potassium iodide. But this specifically is a drug for radiation sickness, so after exposure. So there's a $290 million procurement of the drug Nplate to treat acute radiation syndrome was announced by the U.S. Health and Human Services. So they at least think it's worth spending $300 million on to be prepared for this. I think you should think that it's worth $300. Pick up yourself one of these because, first of all, the instant anything actually happens, even like a nuclear test that someone sets off in the middle of a field somewhere, or we just saw North Korea launch a missile over Japan. They could do anything at any point. In fact, we are going to see a second front open up in this war. I predict an expansion, but specifically a second front, I'll get into that in a minute, is certainly going to happen at some point. And once anything like that happens, or even a major escalation in the rhetoric maybe, this stuff's going to be gone. You're not going to be able to get it. And even right now, it probably takes 3 to 4 weeks maybe, depending on the current demand. Please just, if you ever think it's necessary, go buy it. Link in the description. You don't have to get it from them or through my link or whatever. It's just easy. But make sure you have it because it's going to disappear instantly as soon as any of this stuff happens. And so the government confirmed it. First purchase of the drug manufactured by the California pharmaceutical company Amgen. The purchase comes after Vladimir Putin renewed his threat of nuclear war in a speech last month. He vowed to use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia and its people. This is not a bluff. And I've said before too that if you think that Ukraine's winning, then that's probably even more likely that Russia would do something crazy by going and retaliated with nuclear weapons or something along those lines. And that regardless of how it's bad for Ukraine, obviously, the lowest chance of any massive expansion in nuclear war would be if the war were to end quickly for any reasons, but specifically if Russia were to win. Regardless of whether you think that's good or not, I do think that that's what makes the lowest chance of there being a nuclear conflict. I don't think, hopefully, that NATO forces would initiate any nuclear attack, but, who knows at that point. But let's see some predictions from people. I've talked about trying to keep track of predictions. Vox Dave, I've talked about before. He's done a pretty good job of predicting what goes on so far, and he has a list of other people's predictions, and then his own, which I tend to agree with. But so we have Francis Fukuyama, who's like a political scientist basically. A much bigger Russian collapse will unfold in the coming days. And then General David Petraeus said no amount of shambolic mobilization, which is the only way to describe it, no amount of annexation, no amount of even veiled nuclear threats can actually get Putin out of this particular situation. He is losing, and the battlefield reality he faces is, I think, irreversible. It's interesting the way they treat Ukraine reclaiming 1 to 2% of the area of the country versus how they treat Russia taking 20%. It's similar to like if there's a football game and it's 14-0 and then the other team scores a field goal and like, oh man, look, they're wilting, this the momentum shifting and all this, and like, yeah, that they had a success here, but it's still 14-3. So let's wait and see before we get too excited. And then General H.R. McMaster says this is a tremendous victory for the Ukrainians, and it's a victory that I think that they could turn into a cascading series of defeats of Russian forces. What we might be at here is really the precipice of really the collapse of the Russian army in Ukraine. And even JJ on Reality Survival said that he thinks that we're very likely to see different kinds of or collapse in Russia in different ways, and I disagree with that. Scott Adams, the greatest predictor in the world, says, I think that everything we've seen is suggestive of near collapse of the Soviet military, like a near total collapse, and I think that the United States and NATO probably sees that this is an opportunity for a complete collapse of the Russian military, and they're going to take it. I think the battle for Ukraine is over. I mean, I agree that it's over, you know, well, in the sense that the outcome is determined. And we've seen, like, this has been, how many times have we heard this stuff? We've heard these things, and these people are been wrong about everything so far. They how often have we heard early on that Ukraine is winning, the grandmas were stealing Russian tanks, and the farmers were shooting down, you know, fighter jets with their shotguns, and the ghost of Kiev, and the supermodels that are going to war, and this has nothing to do with my thoughts on Ukraine or Russia. It just has to do 100% with my assessment of the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is the people who is that if you just you saw, like, say the day that Russia invaded, you fell into a coma and you woke up now, it's 6 months later and they've taken over 20% of the country. And massive Ukrainian casualties, we've had to send them billions and billions and billions of dollars from NATO, and Russia's still taken over half the country, or not, sorry, 20% of the country at a manpower disadvantage while specifically avoiding just carpet bombing the whole country. And now they've mobilized hundreds of thousands of more troops. So what do we think is going to happen now? That they're not even at a manpower disadvantage, and we're going into winter where there's even like adages about not fighting Russia in the winter. Yes, I realize that Ukraine is also going to be equally as prepared for winter as Russia. But so here's the alternative side. And it goes along with what we've seen historically from Russia, what we've seen actually happening over the past few months. Like I said, don't ignore all the headlines from Russia, ignore all the headlines from Ukraine. Just look at what have we seen in the past 6 months since this happened, and it's already have advanced to 18 to 20% of the country. And there's no reason to think that that can't continue, especially if they felt like they thought they were losing. So here's Vox Day's prediction. Quote, the success of the Ukrainian offensives are the result of Novo-Russian military forces falling back in preparation for a major Russian winter offensive that will envelop the advancing Ukrainian positions, place considerably more Ukrainian land under Russian control than before, and put significant pressure on the Kiev regime to leave Ukraine. This will happen before the end of the year and may be accompanied by a formal declaration of war, followed by opening of a second front in a different theater. And I talked about that too, is that at some point we absolutely are going to see a second front, just like we see in all these major conflicts, whether that's because it's a strategic move egged on by one of the major sides in the conflict, or if it's a smaller actor like a North Korea, you know, trying to take advantage of the fact that the major powers are tied up against each other and they can get away with stuff without having to deal with, you know, input or interference from the large powers that would normally come in on one side or the other. They're busy over here, so now I'm going to come over and do something else. So we could see that North Korea and Korea. We could see that China and Taiwan, which is one of the more likely ones. We see already seeing skirmishes between countries like Azerbaijan and Armenia, and obviously Iran and Israel, and Arab stuff could go crazy over there too. So that stuff's going to happen. The more heated everything gets here, the more likely that is to happen. And there's just no real reason to think that Russia's just going to leave. And that's what I'm saying. The scariest outcome is if we really think Russia's getting their ass kicked. Because even if you think that's good, and none of this is what I'm saying has anything to do with a value statement about whether the outcome, one or the other, is good or bad. It's just what I think is happening and what the cause and effect is going to be. And Russia losing in Ukraine, getting pushed back to their borders, and certainly maybe even pushed beyond them in any way, is much more likely for them to resort to much more aggressive and maniacal actions using nuclear weapons, actually bombing like nuclear power plants. And because as of right now, we've seen Russia be, regardless of whatever you think should happen, like I said, Russia has been relatively restrained in what they could do to Ukraine. If their actual goal was just the utter destruction of Ukraine, they could do a lot more damage than they're doing now. And I do think that they're just taking a little bit of time to wait for winter, allow the Ukrainian forces to expand unprotected, or unsupported compared to like a normal line, train up the troops that they've mobilized a little bit, get their logistical stuff set up, moves these assets to the front, and then just close off these areas that have extended, retake those, and push even beyond it. And like I said, eventually Russia had been having a manpower disadvantage, and now they're going to have an advantage, and they're going to need more troops in Ukraine. So at some point, NATO troops or other forces are going to have to go in to maintain that, or Russia will just take over. So that's my thoughts on the matter. I know a lot of you guys disagree with that, but like I said, look back. What were we hearing the first few weeks? We're hearing that, oh my God, Russia sucks, all their stuff is old, they're driving horse carts basically. And like there's always elements of truth to all this, rhetoric that you hear from both sides. But like I said, don't look at what people are saying, don't look at what Russia's saying, don't look at what Ukraine is saying. Look at what's actually happened. And the bottom line is, if you just hadn't known any of the details and you just went in a coma and woke up, is that Russia's taken over 20% of the country, and now they're mobilizing with, a couple 100,000 troops, and now they're mobilizing anywhere from 300 to 1.2 million troops, depending on what sources you believe. And what do you think is going to happen? So we'll see. But keeping track for receipts. Let me know what you guys think. Post your thoughts in the comments. And if you have a link to someone else's prediction on YouTube, like an actual commentator and stuff, if it's your prediction, just put it in the comments. Otherwise, email me, rulethewasteland@gmail.com. I'll add it to the spreadsheet. And please, if you're at all worried, especially if you're in Europe, please pick up one of these. Link will be in the description. Get the ThyroSafe. Really not that expensive, a couple $100. They have filters that last 20 years. If you take care of the gas mask, they can last years. And it's a good thing to have for a host of different reasons. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll talk to you later.